The story does not begin with collapse, but with transformation. A transformation so quiet at first that few in the ancient world would have realized they were witnessing the birth of something entirely new. The Roman Empire, once stretching from the windswept edges of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Egypt, was no longer a single unified machine. It was splitting slowly, inevitably, like a great vessel under too much pressure. And in the year 330 AD, an emperor named Constantine would make a decision that would alter the course of history for more than 1,000 years. He would move the heart of Rome, not destroy it, not replace it, but shift it eastward into a city that would come to be known as Constantinople. A city built on ancient Greek foundations called Byzantium, chosen not for tradition, but for survival. Because the West was weakening. Barbarian pressures were mounting on the Rhine and Danube frontiers, political instability was rising, and the old capital of Rome itself was becoming increasingly vulnerable. Constantine saw what others refused to accept. The world of Rome was changing. And so, on the shores of the Bosporus, where Europe and Asia nearly touch, he founded a new imperial capital. A city that would be called Nova Roma, New Rome. But history would remember it as Constantinople. A city designed not just for governance, but for endurance. Massive walls, strategic waters, control over trade routes between continents. It was Rome, reborn in stone and sea and sky. And yet, in those early decades, the people did not see themselves as anything other than Romans. They spoke Latin in administration, upheld Roman law, and carried Roman identity in their bones. But beneath the surface, something was already shifting. The eastern provinces were more Greek than Latin. Trade flowed eastward into Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. The cultural gravity of the empire was tilting. Slowly, silently, inexorably. And as centuries passed, that shift would become irreversible. But in the beginning, there was still unity. Still the illusion of one empire. Then came the fractures. In 395 AD, the Roman Empire was officially divided between East and West. Not as enemies, but as administrative necessity. 2 emperors, 2 courts, 1 legacy. The Western Roman Empire, based in Ravenna and once in Rome, struggled under increasing pressure. Germanic tribes pressed harder and harder against its borders. Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths. Names that would echo through history like warning bells. Meanwhile, the eastern half endured. Stronger, richer, more stable, more defensible. Constantinople, surrounded by water on 3 sides and protected by towering walls, became the true seat of Roman continuity. But something important must be understood here. No one living in Constantinople at the time called it the Byzantine Empire. That name would come much later, imposed by historians. To them, they were simply Romans. The Roman Empire, alive, continuing, surviving. Even as the West began to fracture beyond repair. In 410 AD, Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths. A moment that shattered the psychological illusion of Roman invincibility. And yet, even then, Constantinople endured. Fortified, organized, adaptable. The Eastern Roman Empire absorbed shocks that would have destroyed lesser states. And it did so not by standing still, but by evolving. Greek increasingly replaced Latin as the language of administration. Christianity became the central ideological force binding the empire together. The emperor was no longer just a political leader, but a sacred figure chosen by God ruling under divine authority. This fusion of Roman governance, Greek culture, and Christian theology would become the foundation of what we now call the Byzantine world. But in these early centuries, it was still forming, still unstable, still becoming itself. Then came the moment that changed everything in the West. In 476 AD, the last Roman emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. No dramatic explosion, no final glorious battle, just silence. The Western Roman Empire, as a political entity, ceased to exist. Its institutions collapsed, its cities fragmented, its authority dissolved into a patchwork of kingdoms. But in the East, the empire continued, unbroken, unyielding, still calling itself Roman. Now, for the first time in history, Rome existed only in the East, and the weight of survival fell entirely upon Constantinople. The city was no longer just an imperial capital. It was the empire. But survival alone was not enough. To endure, the Eastern Roman state had to adapt constantly to a world growing more dangerous with each passing generation. Barbarian kingdoms rose in the West. Persia remained a constant rival in the East. Trade routes became contested arteries of wealth and influence. And Constantinople, at the center of it all, became a fortress of civilization surrounded by uncertainty. Its walls, later strengthened under Theodosius II, would become legendary. 3 layers of defense, stretching for miles, nearly impregnable for 1,000 years. But walls alone do not sustain an empire. Governance does. Law does. Identity does. And here, the Eastern Roman world achieved something extraordinary. It preserved Roman law, systematized it, refined it, and prepared it for future generations in the form of legal codifications that would later define medieval Europe. It preserved Greek philosophy, literature, and science, while much of the Western classical world faded into fragmentation. And it preserved Christianity not as a peripheral faith, but as the ideological core of imperial identity. The emperor was God's representative on earth. The empire was the earthly reflection of divine order. To serve the empire was to serve God. This fusion of faith and governance created something uniquely resilient. But resilience always comes at a cost. Because as the centuries advanced, the empire found itself increasingly surrounded. Pressures from the north, the Slavs and Bulgars. Pressures from the east, the Sassanid Persians. And internal challenges that came with maintaining such a vast and diverse territory. The Eastern Roman Empire was no longer expanding. It was holding, enduring, waiting. And then, in the early 6th century, a new force would rise that would test the empire's survival like never before. But before that transformation, the Eastern Roman world still carried the illusion of imperial stability. Palaces still gleamed in Constantinople. Chariot races still roared in the Hippodrome. Diplomacy still flowed through golden halls. And emperors still believed, at least for a time, that Rome could be restored to its former glory. But history, as always, was moving in a different direction. Quietly beneath the surface, new pressures were gathering. And the greatest test of the Eastern Roman Empire had not yet arrived. Not war, not invasion, but ambition itself. The Eastern Roman Empire entered the 6th century with a fragile confidence, as if history itself had granted it a second chance. And in 527 AD, that fragile confidence would be placed in the hands of a man determined to restore Rome to its ancient glory. His name was Justinian, and his vision was not survival. It was resurrection. From the very beginning of his reign, Justinian did not think like a caretaker of a shrinking Eastern remnant. He thought like a conqueror of a lost world. He saw himself as the heir to Caesar, Augustus, Trajan. And in his mind, the Roman Empire was not divided. It had simply been temporarily taken from its rightful shape. So he set out to rebuild it. But ambition of this scale demands instruments of equal force. And Justinian found his in Belisarius, a general whose brilliance would become legend. Calm under pressure, precise in strategy, and capable of turning outnumbered armies into instruments of victory. Under Justinian's command, Belisarius began one of the most astonishing military campaigns in ancient history. First came the West. The Vandals in North Africa were the first target. A kingdom that had once sacked Rome now ruled over the grain-rich provinces that fed the Mediterranean world. In 533 AD, Belisarius launched a lightning campaign. Within months, the Vandal kingdom collapsed. Carthage fell. North Africa was reclaimed. And suddenly, the Mediterranean was no longer fractured. It was partially Roman again. Justinian's dream began to feel real. Then came Italy, the heart of the old empire. The land of emperors and senators, now ruled by the Ostrogoths. What followed was not a quick conquest, but a brutal grinding war. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Rome itself was captured, lost, and captured again. The population suffered famine, siege, destruction. And yet, the imperial armies pushed forward. Step by step, fortress by fortress, the Eastern Roman Empire clawed its way back into the Western world. For a brief moment in history, it seemed possible that Rome might truly be restored. A single empire spanning the Mediterranean once again. But beneath the triumph, cracks were forming. Because empire is not rebuilt by conquest alone. It must also be sustained. And Justinian's wars were expensive, devastatingly so. Then came catastrophe. In the 540s, a plague swept across the empire, later known as the Plague of Justinian. It struck Constantinople with terrifying speed. Bodies piled in the streets. Trade collapsed. Labor disappeared. The military weakened. And the imperial dream, so recently revived, began to falter under the weight of invisible death. It is estimated that millions died across the empire. And even Justinian himself fell ill, though he survived. But survival did not mean recovery. The empire was now stretched thin. Its resources drained. Its population diminished. Its enemies waiting. And yet Justinian pressed on. He codified Roman law in one of history's most influential legal works, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a systematic collection of laws that would shape legal systems across Europe for centuries to come. He rebuilt Constantinople in marble and gold. And most famously, he constructed the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral so vast, so luminous, so architecturally daring that chroniclers claimed it seemed to defy gravity itself. When Justinian entered it for the first time, he is said to have declared, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." In that moment, the empire was not just political. It was divine architecture made visible. But while Justinian dreamed of eternity, the world beyond his borders was changing rapidly. In the East, the Sassanid Empire of Persia remained a constant rival. The two superpowers of the ancient world locked in endless cycles of war and exhaustion. Meanwhile, new forces were emerging from the Arabian Peninsula, unseen until they erupted onto the world stage with extraordinary speed. But Justinian would not live to see the full consequences of these transformations. He died in 565 AD. And with his death, the illusion of restored Roman unity began to fade. The empire he left behind was larger than when he inherited it, but also weaker, more vulnerable, more exposed. His successors inherited an overstretched state, surrounded by enemies on all sides. And almost immediately, the pressure became unbearable. In the decades following Justinian's death, the empire was pulled into wars on multiple fronts. The Persians renewed their offensives. The Balkans were flooded by Slavic migrations. Northern frontiers collapsed under pressure, and the imperial treasury struggled to sustain it all. Then came the most transformative shock of all. In the early 7th century, a new power emerged from Arabia. United under a new religious and political vision, Arab armies expanded with astonishing speed. They struck first at Byzantine-controlled Syria, then Egypt, then across North Africa. Within a generation, some of the richest provinces of the empire were gone. Lost forever. The Mediterranean world, once briefly reunited under Justinian, was fractured again. But this time, the loss was permanent, and the empire's center of gravity shifted once more, back toward Anatolia and Constantinople itself. In 626 AD, the empire faced one of its most desperate moments. The combined forces of Persians and Avars besieged Constantinople. If the city fell, the empire would collapse. But the walls held, the navy held, and the city endured. It was not expansion that saved the empire, but defense, adaptation, survival. Shortly after, Emperor Heraclius launched a bold counteroffensive against Persia, a daring series of campaigns that reversed years of humiliation. For a brief moment, the empire surged back, but it was the last great classical act of the Eastern Roman world, because history was now entering a new phase. The world of antiquity was ending, and medieval Byzantium was beginning to take shape. A smaller empire, a more defensive empire, but a more focused one. The loss of the eastern provinces forced Constantinople to reimagine itself. No longer the center of a Mediterranean superpower, it became a heavily fortified imperial island in a sea of emerging civilizations. And its identity shifted accordingly. Greek culture now fully dominated administration. Christian orthodoxy became the unifying ideological force. Military organization evolved into the theme system, where land and soldiers were integrated for regional defense. The empire was no longer built for expansion. It was built for endurance. And yet, even endurance has limits. Because beyond the empire's borders, new powers were rising. The Islamic caliphates in the east, the Bulgarian states in the north, and later the fracturing Latin West. By the end of the 7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had been transformed beyond recognition. It was no longer the Mediterranean superpower of Justinian. It was something leaner, harsher, more resilient. A civilization that had learned how to survive by letting go. And in that survival, it discovered a new identity. One that historians would later call Byzantium. But to those who lived it, it was still Rome, still eternal, still watching the world change around it. Even as it changed itself, the Eastern Roman Empire entered the late 6th and early 7th centuries already wounded, but not yet broken. What followed would test whether it was truly an empire of Rome or simply the echo of one. Because survival in this new age was no longer guaranteed. It had to be earned repeatedly against enemies multiplying on every frontier. And at the center of this storm stood an empire that was slowly being reshaped by pressure, loss, and necessity. The first great strain came from the east. The Sassanid Persian Empire had long been Rome's greatest rival. A mirror civilization, equally ancient, equally proud, equally relentless. And in the early 600s, that rivalry erupted into one of the most destructive wars in antiquity. The Byzantine Sassanid War of 602–628 was not a border conflict. It was a civilizational collision. Cities burned. Armies crossed entire regions with little resistance. And for a terrifying moment, the Eastern Roman Empire began to unravel. By the 610s, the Persians had advanced deep into Byzantine territory. Syria fell. Jerusalem fell. Egypt fell. The breadbasket of the empire gone. The symbolic heart of Christianity lost. And the empire's lifeline to wealth and grain severed. Constantinople stood alone, surrounded, strained, and increasingly desperate. At this point, the empire was not just declining. It was collapsing inward. And yet, in moments of deepest crisis, empires often produce their most unlikely saviors. Heraclius, a young emperor who inherited a state on the edge of extinction. Rather than defend the capital passively, he made a decision that stunned his enemies. He would strike directly at the heart of Persia. In a move that defied conventional strategy, Heraclius rebuilt the army, reorganized logistics, and launched a counter-invasion into enemy territory. It was a gamble of almost unimaginable risk. Because if he failed, Constantinople itself would be undefended. But if he succeeded, the entire war could be reversed. What followed was one of the most dramatic military turnarounds in ancient history. Heraclius moved through Armenia and deep into Persian lands, forcing the enemy to recall troops from occupied Byzantine territories. The war shifted, slowly, painfully, but decisively. And in 627 AD, the climax arrived at the Battle of Nineveh. A brutal confrontation deep within Persian territory. The Byzantine forces, exhausted but determined, broke the Sassanid army. The Persian Empire, once dominant, began to collapse under its own internal instability. Within a year, the war ended. Byzantium had survived. But survival had come at an enormous cost. The empire was drained, exhausted, economically shattered. And its eastern provinces, though technically recovered, were left devastated. There was no time to recover. Because beyond the southern deserts, a new force was emerging. One that neither Rome nor Persia had fully anticipated. In the Arabian Peninsula, a new religious and political movement had unified previously fragmented tribes. Within a generation, it would change the world. The Islamic caliphates emerged with extraordinary speed. Driven by unity, mobility, and ideological conviction, Arab armies began expanding outward in the 630s. The weakened Byzantine Empire was their first major target. And this time, there would be no miraculous counteroffensive. The empire was simply too exhausted. In 636 AD, at the Battle of Yarmouk, Byzantine forces suffered a catastrophic defeat. Syria was lost. Then Palestine. Then Egypt. Within a few decades, the empire lost nearly all of its richest eastern provinces. The Mediterranean world, once briefly reunited under Justinian, now fractured permanently into competing civilizations. The Eastern Roman Empire, once spanning 3 continents, was reduced to Anatolia, parts of the Balkans, and Constantinople itself. But here, something remarkable happened. Instead of dying, the empire adapted. It restructured itself into a defensive civilization. Its priorities shifted completely. Survival replaced expansion. Defense replaced conquest. Identity replaced geography. And at the core of this transformation was the theme system, a revolutionary reorganization of the empire into military districts. Soldiers were no longer distant professional armies funded by imperial gold. They were local landholders, farmers' soldiers, tied directly to the land they defended. It was not glamorous, but it was effective. And in this transformation, Byzantium became something fundamentally new. A militarized, agrarian empire. Compact, resilient, deeply fortified. Constantinople itself became the ultimate stronghold. A city protected by sea, walls, and strategic depth. Even as enemies surrounded it, it remained nearly impossible to take. In 674 AD, the Arab Caliphate launched its first major siege of Constantinople. It lasted years. Fleet after fleet attempted to breach the city. But the Byzantines deployed a devastating technological advantage. Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon that could burn even on water. Arab ships were destroyed. Assaults failed, and the city endured. Again and again. By 718 AD, a second massive siege was launched. Once more, Constantinople held. And once more, the empire survived what should have been its end. By the early 8th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had entered a new identity phase. It was no longer a Mediterranean empire. It was a fortress civilization, surrounded by Islamic caliphates to the east and South Slavic kingdoms to the north and fragmented Latin successor states in the west. But within its shrinking borders, something important was happening. Consolidation. Greek had fully replaced Latin. Orthodox Christianity had become deeply integrated into state identity. Imperial authority was now seen as divinely sanctioned, not merely political. And the emperor was both ruler and sacred symbol of order. But even within this stability, internal conflict emerged. One of the most significant was the iconoclasm controversy, a theological and political struggle over the use of religious images. Should icons of Christ and the saints be venerated or destroyed? Emperor Leo III initiated the movement to ban icons, believing they violated divine law. What followed was decades of religious and political turmoil. Monasteries resisted. Populations divided. Emperors rose and fell over the issue. It was not just theology. It was identity. What did it mean to be Roman in this new world? The crisis eventually ended, but it left lasting scars. And yet, despite all internal and external pressures, the empire did not collapse. Instead, it stabilized. By the mid-8th century, Byzantium had achieved something extraordinary. It had transformed catastrophe into structure, loss into identity, retreat into resilience. It was smaller than before, stronger in some ways, more rigid in others. But it had survived the greatest transformation in its history. And from this survival, a new era would emerge. One not of crisis, but of renewal. A renaissance hidden within a fortress. But that transformation would belong to the next chapter of its story. Because Byzantium, as it entered the 9th century, was about to rise again. Not as Rome of old, but as something entirely new. By the early 9th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had done something few civilizations ever achieve after catastrophe. It had stabilized, not by returning to its former glory, but by redefining what survival meant. The empire that once ruled the Mediterranean now ruled something smaller, sharper, more concentrated. a world built around Anatolia, the Balkans, and Constantinople itself. And yet, within this reduced geography, a new kind of confidence began to emerge. Slowly at first, like light returning after a long eclipse. This was the beginning of what historians later called the Macedonian Renaissance. But to those living it, it was not a renaissance. It was simply recovery. In 867 AD, Basil I came to power, the founder of the Macedonian dynasty. His rise was not the product of noble lineage or inherited right. It was the result of ambition, intelligence, and ruthless political navigation within the imperial court. And under his rule, the empire began to stabilize once more. Administrative systems were strengthened. Legal codes were refined. The military was reorganized. And most importantly, imperial authority regained consistency after decades of instability. But Basil's significance was not just political. It was structural. He created the foundation for a century and a half of relative strength. And his successors would build upon it. Under the Macedonian dynasty, the empire shifted from defensive survival to controlled expansion. Not empire building in the old Roman sense, but strategic reinforcement of borders. In the Balkans, Byzantine influence expanded northward. Bulgarian resistance was gradually contained. In the east, Anatolian frontiers were stabilized against Arab forces. And slowly, the empire began to feel like an organized state again rather than a besieged fortress. But perhaps the most profound transformation was cultural. This was a period of intellectual revival. Manuscripts were copied and preserved. Classical Greek texts that might have been lost were carefully maintained in monastic libraries. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and literature all experienced renewed attention. It was not innovation in the modern sense, but preservation as power. Byzantium understood something crucial. To preserve knowledge was to preserve identity, and identity was survival. At the same time, Christianity expanded beyond imperial borders. Missionaries traveled north into Slavic lands. Two brothers in particular, Cyril and Methodius, developed a written script for Slavic languages. This allowed the transmission of Orthodox Christianity into regions that would eventually become Bulgaria, Serbia, and even Kievan Rus. In doing so, Byzantium was no longer just an empire. It became a civilizational transmitter, a source of cultural gravity for Eastern Europe. But while culture expanded outward, military strength also reached its peak. The empire's greatest military emperor emerged in this era. Basil II, known later as the Bulgar Slayer. His reign marked the height of Macedonian Byzantine power. For decades, he campaigned relentlessly against the Bulgarian Empire. Not through single decisive battles alone, but through sustained pressure, siege warfare, and strategic attrition. One of the most famous moments of his reign came after the Battle of Claudion in 1014. A crushing Byzantine victory. According to later accounts, thousands of captured Bulgarian soldiers were blinded, with one man left sighted in each group to lead the others home. Whether fully accurate or exaggerated, the story reflects the brutal psychological nature of medieval warfare. And its purpose was clear: to end resistance permanently. By 1018, Bulgaria had been fully absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. The Balkans were largely under imperial control. And for a brief moment in history, Byzantium stood at its medieval peak. A powerful centralized state, a dominant military force in the region, a cultural beacon for Orthodox Christianity. a legal and administrative system refined over centuries. It seemed almost stable. But beneath this surface, structural weaknesses were forming. Because Basil II's success depended heavily on centralized authority. And when he died in 1025, he left no strong successor capable of maintaining that system. What followed was a slow unraveling. The Macedonian dynasty weakened. Power shifted from the emperor to aristocratic landowners. Military landholding systems began to decay as land concentrated in elite hands. And the professional integrity of the army slowly eroded. At the same time, new external threats were emerging. In the east, a new Turkic power was rising. The Seljuk Turks. Nomadic, mobile, militarily effective. They began moving into Anatolia, the very heartland of the empire. But Byzantium, now weakened by internal fragmentation, struggled to respond effectively. Instead of unified defense, the empire relied increasingly on mercenaries. Foreign soldiers loyal only to payment, not to Rome. This shift would prove disastrous. Because while mercenaries could fight, they could not sustain imperial cohesion. By the mid-11th century, the empire was increasingly unstable. Political infighting became common. Emperors were replaced rapidly. Civil wars drained resources. And the military frontier in Anatolia began to collapse. Then came the turning point. 1071 AD. The Battle of Manzikert. A moment that would permanently alter the trajectory of Byzantine history. The imperial army, led by Emperor Romanos IV, faced the Seljuk Turks under Alp Arslan. The battle was chaotic, disorganized, and undermined by internal betrayal and poor coordination. At a critical moment, segments of the Byzantine army withdrew or defected. The imperial formation collapsed. Romanos IV was captured, and the Byzantine army was destroyed. Manzikert was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological shock. Anatolia, the empire's core recruitment and economic region, began to slip out of imperial control. Turkic groups moved in rapidly. Byzantine authority fractured, and the central structure of the empire was permanently weakened. This moment is often considered the beginning of irreversible decline. Because after Manzikert, Byzantium no longer controlled its own heartland. But even now, the empire did not collapse. Instead, it adapted again. It sought help from the West. And in doing so, it would trigger a chain of events that neither East nor West could fully control. Because the empire was about to become entangled in a new force rising in Europe. The Crusades. And with them, a relationship that would begin as alliance and end in catastrophe. But that story belongs to the next turning point in Byzantine history. A moment where survival would depend not only on armies, but on trust. And trust was about to break. After Manzikert, the Eastern Roman Empire was no longer the dominant force of Anatolia. It was something more fragile, more uncertain. An empire trying to hold together a body that was already beginning to drift apart. And in the aftermath of 1071, the world around Byzantium changed faster than the empire itself could respond. Turkic groups moved into Anatolia in waves, not as a single conquesting army, but as a gradual migration of power. Villages changed hands. Trade routes shifted. Local authority dissolved. And for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the empire's core territory was no longer secure. Constantinople remained intact, powerful, and heavily fortified. But the lands that fed it, armed it, and sustained it were slipping away. And in this moment of crisis, Byzantium made a decision that would reshape its entire future. It turned westward, not towards Rome of old, but toward the emerging powers of Latin Christendom. In 1081, a new dynasty came to power, the Komnenos family, and with it, a renewed attempt to stabilize the empire from within. Alexios I Komnenos inherited a state on the edge of fragmentation. The treasury was empty. The army was weakened. Anatolia was largely lost, and enemies surrounded the empire on every frontier. So he did something unexpected. He appealed for help, not to Persia, not to the Turks, but to the West, to the Latin Christian kingdoms of Europe. This request would have consequences far beyond what Alexios could have imagined. Because in Western Europe, a new religious and military energy was rising. Knighthood, pilgrimage, and holy war were beginning to merge into a single concept. And when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, the response exceeded all expectations. Tens of thousands of warriors, nobles, peasants, and adventurers set out for the East. Their stated goal was to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. But their route passed directly through Byzantine territory. And here, two worlds collided. The Byzantines saw disciplined diplomacy. The Crusaders saw sacred mission. The Byzantines expected temporary military assistance. The Crusaders often saw opportunity, wealth, and land. Alexios I attempted to manage this influx carefully. He extracted oaths from Crusader leaders, promising that recaptured lands formerly held by Byzantium would be returned to imperial control. And in some cases, this worked. The First Crusade achieved surprising success. In 1099, Jerusalem was captured, and a series of Crusader states were established in the Levant. But trust between East and West, instead of being strengthened, began to erode. Because the cultural gap was deep. Language differences, religious disputes, and competing political ambitions created tension beneath every interaction. The Byzantines viewed the Latin Crusaders as undisciplined and unpredictable. The Crusaders viewed the Byzantines as deceptive and overly cautious. What had begun as a fragile alliance was already becoming something unstable. Still, the Komnenian dynasty managed to restore partial strength. Under Alexios I, and later his son John II and grandson Manuel I, the empire experienced a limited revival. Anatolian coastlines were partially recovered. The army was restructured into a more professional force. Diplomatic relations with the West were carefully maintained. And for a brief moment, Byzantium reasserted itself as a regional power. But this revival came with a cost. To secure military support, the empire increasingly granted trade privileges to Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa. At first, this seemed practical. Venetian fleets helped defend Byzantine interests. Genoese merchants stimulated trade. But over time, these privileges grew into dependency. Foreign merchants gained control over key parts of the empire's economy. Byzantine economic autonomy slowly eroded. And within Constantinople itself, resentment began to grow. Then came the rupture. The Fourth Crusade. In 1204, what was intended as a campaign to reach the Holy Land instead turned inward. Crusader forces, heavily influenced by Venetian leadership and internal political disputes, diverted toward Constantinople. The reasons were complex, involving debt politics and manipulation of Crusader leadership. But the outcome was simple. The greatest Christian city in the Eastern world was attacked by Western Christian armies. And in April 1204, Constantinople fell. What followed was one of the most devastating events in medieval history. The city was looted. Churches were stripped of relics. Libraries were destroyed. Artworks were carried away to Western Europe. The imperial palace was plundered, and the ancient continuity of Roman Constantinople was violently shattered. A new regime was installed, the Latin Empire, a Western-controlled state ruling from the ruins of the former Byzantine capital. But it was unstable from the beginning, because the Byzantine world did not disappear. It fractured. Surviving Byzantine elites fled to successor states: the Empire of Nicaea in western Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in the Balkans, and the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. These states preserved Byzantine identity in exile. Culture continued. Administration continued. The idea of Rome continued. But Constantinople itself was lost. For nearly 6 decades, the city remained under Latin control, a hollow version of its former self. Meanwhile, the Byzantine successor state slowly rebuilt strength. The most important of these was Nicaea. Under the leadership of the Lascarid dynasty, Nicaea became the center of Byzantine continuity. Military reforms were introduced. Territory was stabilized. And slowly, the idea of reclaiming Constantinople became realistic again. Then, in 1261, the opportunity came. Michael VI Palaiologos launched a surprise campaign. And almost without resistance, Byzantine forces re-entered Constantinople. The Latin Empire collapsed, and the city was restored to Byzantine control. The empire had returned, but it was not the same empire. It was smaller, weaker, more isolated, and permanently altered by its trauma. The reconquest of Constantinople was a symbolic victory, but not a structural recovery, because while the empire had regained its capital, it had lost much of its former territory, influence, and economic strength. The Mediterranean world had changed irreversibly. New powers had emerged, and Byzantium once again was forced to adapt, not as a dominant empire, but as a surviving fragment of its former self. And in this new reality, a slow decline began, one that would last nearly 2 centuries, until the final confrontation with history itself, when Michael VII Palaiologos reclaimed Constantinople in 1261. It was not a triumphant rebirth in the way empires imagine their restorations. There were no vast celebrations across a unified realm, no returning provinces, no restored imperial dominance over the Mediterranean. Instead, there was silence. A city reclaimed, but a world still lost. Constantinople had been taken back, yes, but the empire it once anchored had been shattered into fragments that no longer fully obeyed its center. The Palaiologan dynasty inherited a difficult truth. Byzantium had survived its greatest trauma, but it had not recovered from it. The Latin occupation had stripped away not just wealth and territory, but institutional continuity. And the world around it had moved on. Venice and Genoa now dominated Mediterranean trade. New Balkan powers were emerging. And in Anatolia, a new force was rising from the remnants of the Seljuk fragmentation: the Ottomans. But at first, Byzantium did not perceive them as an existential threat. They were just another Turkish emirate among many. Small, regional, manageable. That assumption would prove fatal over time. In the decades after 1261, Byzantium attempted to rebuild itself once more. But this rebuilding was fundamentally different from earlier recoveries. In the past, the empire had lost territories and regained them. Now it had lost the capacity to regain them at all. Its resources were limited. Its manpower was shrinking, and its political influence was increasingly confined to the walls of Constantinople itself. The empire had become, in effect, a city-state with imperial memories. Still, there were moments of brilliance. The Paleologan period saw a final cultural flowering. Art became more expressive, more emotional, more introspective. Mosaics and frescoes of this era show a deep psychological intensity not seen in earlier Byzantine works. Theological writing deepened. Philosophical debates revived classical Greek traditions. Scholars preserved ancient texts that would later flow into the Renaissance West. In a strange irony, even as Byzantium weakened politically, it strengthened its role as a cultural bridge between antiquity and modern Europe. But culture alone cannot defend borders, and Byzantium's borders were collapsing. In the Balkans, Serbian power expanded rapidly under Stefan Dusan. He even proclaimed himself emperor, directly challenging Byzantine imperial legitimacy. In Anatolia, Ottoman power consolidated under a series of capable leaders. And unlike earlier Turkish groups, the Ottomans were not just raiders. They were state builders. Organized, expanding, systematic. They began to absorb surrounding emirates, unifying territory that had once been fragmented. And gradually, they approached the Byzantine frontier. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, Byzantium found itself squeezed between rising powers. To the west, Latin states and Italian maritime republics controlled trade. To the north, Serbian and Bulgarian kingdoms competed for influence. To the east, the Ottomans expanded steadily into Anatolia. The empire was now surrounded, not by equals, but by successors. Civilizations that had learned from its structures, but no longer needed its approval. Internally, Byzantium was unstable. Civil wars became frequent. Noble families competed for power. Imperial succession crises drained resources and attention. At times, Byzantine emperors even sought Ottoman assistance in internal conflicts, a decision that would later accelerate their own decline. Because once Ottoman forces entered Europe, they did not leave. They stayed and expanded. By the mid-14th century, the Ottomans had crossed into the Balkans. Gallipoli fell in 1354. It was the first permanent Ottoman foothold in Europe. From that point forward, the empire's trajectory was clear. Byzantium was now encircled and shrinking. Constantinople remained the symbolic heart of the empire, but its lifeline to the outside world was narrowing. Trade routes were controlled by Italian merchants. Land routes were increasingly dominated by hostile powers, and military manpower was insufficient to reverse the trend. The empire was no longer declining in dramatic collapse. It was fading through compression, each generation smaller than the last, each border more fragile, each crisis harder to survive. By the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire existed as little more than Constantinople itself, a few surrounding territories and scattered outposts. It had become a shell of its former self. But even in this weakened state, it still held enormous symbolic weight. To the Orthodox Christian world, it remained the last bastion of imperial legitimacy. To the Ottoman Empire, it remained a strategic prize. And to Western Europe, it remained a fading relic of Rome. But within Constantinople, life continued. Churches still functioned. Imperial ceremonies still took place. Diplomats still arrived, and emperors still ruled, though over an empire that barely existed outside the city walls. In the final decades, Byzantine emperors attempted desperate diplomatic strategies. They sought aid from Western Europe. At times, even negotiations for church union were attempted in hopes of military support. But Western responses were inconsistent, delayed, or insufficient. Aid never arrived in time. And the Ottomans, under Sultan Mehmed II, prepared for the final conquest. A young ruler with ambition that mirrored Justinian's centuries earlier, but directed in the opposite direction. Not restoration, but completion. By the early 1450s, Constantinople was encircled. Massive cannons were constructed. Fortifications were reinforced. Naval blockades tightened. And inside the city, defenders prepared for what they understood could be the final stand of the Roman world. The last emperor of Byzantium, Constantine XI Palaiologos, prepared to defend the city named after the first Constantine. A symbolic beginning and a symbolic end. And as spring of 1453 approached, the fate of an empire that had lasted over 1,000 years was about to be decided. Not in gradual decline, but in a single final confrontation. By the mid-15th century, Constantinople no longer resembled the capital of an empire. It resembled a fortress awaiting its final siege. A city surrounded not just by enemies, but by time itself. The Byzantine Empire, once stretching across the Mediterranean, had been reduced to a fragile core. Walls still stood, but the world beyond them had already changed. To the east, the Ottoman Empire had risen with unstoppable momentum. To the west, Europe watched with distant concern, more preoccupied with its own conflicts than with the fate of a dying empire. And at the center of it all stood Constantinople. Still magnificent, still symbolic, still defiant. But isolated. Completely isolated. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, understood what Constantinople represented. It was not just a city. It was a legacy. A bridge between ancient Rome and the medieval world. And as long as it stood, his empire would remain incomplete. So he prepared meticulously. Not for a raid. Not for a campaign. But for a siege that would end an era. Massive cannons were constructed under Hungarian engineer Urban. Weapons unlike anything the medieval world had seen at scale. They were slow, heavy, almost primitive in appearance. But their purpose was simple: to break walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Inside Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos prepared for defense. He was not an emperor of expansion, not an emperor of wealth, but an emperor of endurance, a ruler of a shrinking world who now faced its final contraction. The city's defenses, the legendary Theodosian walls, still inspired awe. 3 layers of stone and earth, reinforced over centuries. They had repelled Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, Crusaders. They had outlasted entire civilizations. But nothing in history had tested them like what was coming. In April 1453, the siege began. Ottoman forces surrounded the city by land and sea. Tens of thousands of soldiers, engineers, and artillery units. The Golden Horn was blocked. Supply routes severed. Constantinople was cut off from the world. And then the bombardment began. Day after day, the cannons fired. Stone after stone, wall after wall, section after section. The ancient defenses began to crack. Not immediately, but inevitably. Each explosion sent tremors through the city's foundations. each breach repaired by defenders working through exhaustion, fear, and dwindling time. Inside the city, life became a cycle of repair, prayer, and waiting. Church bells echoed through narrow streets. Relics were carried in procession. Citizens took refuge in faith because material defense was slowly failing. The Byzantines still had moments of resistance. Sallies from the walls disrupted Ottoman positions. Navy skirmishes attempted to break blockades. And the famous Greek fire was still used in naval defense, burning enemy vessels on the water with terrifying efficiency. But these were temporary successes. The imbalance was overwhelming. The empire was not fighting to win. It was fighting to delay. And maimed II, young, determined, relentless, understood this. He did not rush the siege. He sustained it, systematically, relentlessly, until the walls would inevitably fail. As weeks turned into months, morale inside the city began to fracture. Food supplies dwindled. Soldiers grew exhausted. Hope, once a political necessity, became a personal struggle. And yet, Constantine XI refused to leave. He chose to remain within the city, not as a ruler escaping defeat, but as a Roman emperor fulfilling his final duty. In late May, the final assault was prepared. The Ottoman forces had identified weak points in the walls. Breaches widened by continuous bombardment. Troops were assembled in waves. Janissaries prepared for the decisive push. And inside Constantinople, the final night fell. On the eve of May 29, 1453, the city entered its last hours. Churches filled with worshippers. Emperor Constantine XI attended final prayers. The atmosphere was not purely despair. It was something more complex. Resignation, dignity, and defiance intertwined. Because everyone understood what was ending. Not just a city, not just an empire, but a continuous political identity that had stretched back to Augustus Caesar. That night, the city did not sleep. And when dawn arrived, the final assault began. Ottoman forces surged toward the breaches. Wave after wave pressed against the weakened defenses. The fighting was chaotic, brutal, close quarters. Swords, spears, arrows, smoke, dust, collapse. On the walls, Byzantine defenders fought with everything they had left. Aristocrats, soldiers, civilians, monks, all standing together in a collapsing structure of resistance. Emperor Constantine XI himself fought in the melee, no longer as a ceremonial figure, but as a soldier among soldiers. The final moments of his life are unclear. Some accounts say he was last seen fighting near the breached gate. Others say his body was never definitively identified. But what matters is not the precise detail. It is the symbolism. The last Roman emperor fighting until the end within the last Roman city. And then the breach widened beyond control. Ottoman forces poured into Constantinople. Defense lines collapsed. The city was overrun. By midday, resistance had ended. The Ottoman banner was raised over the city. Constantinople had fallen, and with it, the Eastern Roman Empire ceased to exist. An empire that had lasted over 1,000 years, from the founding of Constantinople in 330 AD to its final collapse in 1453, had reached its end. But what makes Byzantium unique is that its fall was not simply destruction. It was transformation. Because the city did not disappear. It changed hands. Constantinople became Istanbul under Ottoman rule. Hagia Sophia, once the grandest church of Christendom, was converted into a mosque. Imperial institutions were replaced, but not erased. Many administrative systems influenced Ottoman governance. Legal traditions, architectural styles, and court structures carried forward Byzantine legacy in new form. And beyond politics, the impact of Byzantium continued in unexpected ways. Scholars fleeing the fallen city carried Greek manuscripts westward. Texts of Plato, Aristotle, and classical authors helped ignite the Italian Renaissance. In a very real sense, the intellectual world of ancient Greece and Rome survived through Byzantine preservation. Even in defeat, Byzantium shaped the future of Europe. And in the Orthodox world, its spiritual legacy endured. The idea of Constantinople as a sacred imperial center never fully disappeared. For centuries afterward, some traditions would refer to Moscow as the Third Rome, a symbolic continuation of Byzantine religious authority. But the historical empire, the political structure that had governed Eastern Rome for over a millennium was gone. What remained was memory, architecture, text, faith, and influence. The Byzantine Empire did not vanish into nothingness. It dissolved into the foundations of the modern world. But in 1453, that reality was not yet visible. All that could be seen was the end of something vast, something ancient, something that had outlived almost every other civilization of its time. And as the smoke cleared over Constantinople, a new era had begun. One without Roman emperors in the east. One without Byzantine walls guarding the Bosporus. One where the legacy of Rome would live on, not as an empire, but as an inheritance carried by others. And history, once again, moved forward. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 did not erase Byzantium. It dissolved it. And what remained was not a political empire anymore, but a scattered legacy embedded into the future of multiple civilizations. Because empires rarely vanish in a single moment. They unravel, and their threads continue weaving into new forms of power. After the Ottoman conquest, Constantinople, now Istanbul, became the capital of a rising imperial system. But beneath the new administration, layers of Byzantine structure still lingered. Not in banners or emperors, but in institutions, habits, and memory. The Ottomans did not simply replace Byzantium. They absorbed parts of it. Administrative continuity mattered. Tax systems in conquered territories often followed existing Byzantine frameworks. Urban governance in former imperial cities retained familiar structures. Even court ceremonial traditions carried echoes of Constantinople's imperial past. And perhaps most importantly, the city itself remained the center of gravity for the region. Its geography had not changed. Its strategic position between Europe and Asia still unmatched. So while Byzantium as an empire had ended, its spatial logic survived. But the political story of its remnants was only one layer. Another, equally important, unfolded in the intellectual world. When Constantinople fell, thousands of scholars fled westward. They carried with them manuscripts that had been preserved in Byzantine monasteries for centuries. Works of ancient Greek philosophy, science, medicine, and literature. Texts that had survived in Byzantium, while much of Western Europe experienced fragmentation. These manuscripts entered Italy, and from there spread across Europe. And something began to shift. The Renaissance, already emerging in Italian city-states, gained new acceleration. Humanism found fresh material. Classical thought was revived with greater clarity. Greek language studies expanded rapidly. And Western Europe began to reconnect with intellectual traditions that Byzantium had preserved in continuity since antiquity. In this way, the Byzantine Empire became a bridge, not just between Rome and the medieval world, but between antiquity and modernity. Its libraries, scribes, and scholars had unknowingly preserved a civilization's intellectual DNA. And when the empire collapsed, that knowledge did not vanish. It migrated. At the same time, within the Orthodox Christian world, Byzantium's spiritual identity continued. The Eastern Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople before 1453, adapted under Ottoman rule. Religious authority shifted but did not disappear. Bishops maintained continuity. Liturgical traditions remained intact. And the memory of the Byzantine Imperial Church continued to shape Eastern Christian identity. Far to the north, another transformation was unfolding. In the emerging Grand Duchy of Moscow, rulers began to adopt the symbolic legacy of Byzantium. After the fall of Constantinople, Moscow increasingly saw itself as the successor to Orthodox imperial authority. The concept of Third Rome emerged. The idea that Rome had passed from ancient Italy to Constantinople and finally to Moscow. This was not a literal continuation of empire, but a symbolic inheritance of spiritual and political legitimacy. Byzantium had ended as a state, but its ideological framework had not ended with it. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire itself grew into one of the most powerful states of the early modern world. And its success was partially built upon the geographic and administrative foundations inherited from Byzantium. The control of Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, gave the Ottomans command over trade routes between Europe and Asia. The city remained a global hub of commerce and culture. Its harbors, its markets, its strategic position all inherited from its Byzantine past. Even its architectural landscape evolved through layers rather than replacement. Hagia Sophia stood at the center of this transformation. Converted into a mosque, it remained structurally intact for centuries. Its massive dome, once a symbol of Eastern Roman Christianity, now became part of Islamic architectural identity. But its Byzantine engineering legacy continued to inspire architects across both worlds. In Europe, knowledge of Byzantine history became fragmented. For a time, Western scholars viewed Byzantium as a declining medieval civilization rather than a continuous Roman state. The term Byzantine Empire itself was a later historical construction. The people who lived in it always called themselves Romans. And that distinction matters, because it reframes how we understand continuity. Rome did not fall in 476. It evolved. It migrated east. It survived for nearly 1,000 more years. And even after 1453, its influence did not disappear. It dispersed. In law, Roman legal traditions, preserved and systematized by Byzantium, influenced both Islamic legal thought and later European systems. In architecture, domed structures and monumental churches inspired designs across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. In diplomacy, Byzantine statecraft influenced Ottoman court politics and European diplomatic systems. In religion, Orthodox Christianity remained deeply rooted in Byzantine tradition. Even modern national identities in parts of Eastern Europe still carry echoes of Byzantine cultural inheritance. But perhaps the most important legacy is conceptual. Byzantium demonstrated that an empire can transform without fully collapsing. That identity can survive territorial loss. That culture can outlive political fragmentation. And that continuity does not always require expansion. It can survive through adaptation. In its final centuries, Byzantium was no longer the dominant power it once had been. But it had become something else. A preservation engine of classical knowledge. A defensive civilization holding the remnants of ancient Rome. A cultural bridge between eras. And in its fall, it transferred that role to others. So when we look at the Renaissance in Italy, the development of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the rise of Ottoman imperial systems, the emergence of Russian imperial ideology, we are not looking at separate historical phenomena. We are looking at fragments of Byzantine inheritance moving outward into new forms. And that is why Byzantium matters. Not because it survived in political form forever, but because it ensured that ancient Rome did not end in silence. It ended in transmission. And that transmission shaped the world that followed. After 1453, Byzantium no longer existed as an empire. But its influence did not settle. It spread, like embers carried by wind across continents. And in the centuries that followed, those embers continued to ignite new political ideas, new religious identities, and new interpretations of power itself. Because the fall of Constantinople did not close a chapter of history. It opened a long aftermath. In the Ottoman Empire, the conquest of Constantinople became a foundational moment of imperial legitimacy. Mehmed II did not see the city as merely a military prize. He saw it as the seat of universal authority in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so he rebuilt it. Population was restored through forced and voluntary migration. Markets were revived. Religious institutions reorganized. And Istanbul quickly became one of the most important cities in the Islamic world. But even under Ottoman rule, the city retained its deep Byzantine geography. Road networks still followed ancient Roman planning. Aqueduct systems and fortifications still shaped urban life. And beneath new Islamic architecture, the bones of Constantinople remained intact. This was not replacement. It was succession through transformation. Meanwhile, in Europe, the fall of Byzantium triggered a psychological and intellectual shift. Greek scholars fleeing the city arrived in Italian states like Venice, Florence, and Rome. They brought with them not only manuscripts, but linguistic knowledge that had been preserved in the East for over 1,000 years. For Western Europe, this was transformative. Latin had long been the dominant scholarly language. But now, original Greek texts became directly accessible again. Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Galen. Not filtered through centuries of translation loss, but in their original form. This influx of knowledge contributed directly to the acceleration of the Renaissance. Artists began studying classical proportion and perspective. Philosophers revived ancient debates on ethics and governance. Scientists revisited forgotten mathematical and astronomical ideas. In this sense, Byzantium functioned as a cultural reservoir. It preserved the intellectual heritage of antiquity during centuries when much of Western Europe was fragmented. And when that reservoir was opened, it reshaped European intellectual history. At the same time, the Orthodox Christian world reorganized itself. Without Constantinople as its imperial center, authority shifted gradually toward Moscow. The idea of Moscow as the Third Rome was not simply propaganda. It was an ideological framework built on continuity. Rome had been the first center of imperial Christianity. Constantinople had been the second. And after its fall, Moscow claimed the spiritual mantle. This concept influenced Russian state development for centuries. It shaped imperial ideology, religious authority, and even political legitimacy. But Byzantium's influence was not limited to Christian worlds. In Islamic governance, Ottoman administrative systems incorporated elements that had originated in Byzantine practice. Tax collection systems, urban administration, and imperial court protocols all reflected continuity with earlier Eastern Roman structures. Even the concept of a centralized imperial capital controlling diverse provinces mirrored Byzantine precedent. In architecture, the legacy became even more visible. Hagia Sophia stood as the most direct architectural inheritance. Its massive dome, once considered an engineering miracle of Byzantine Christianity, became a model for Ottoman mosques. Architects such as Mimar Sinan studied and expanded upon its design principles. Across both Christian and Islamic worlds, the structural language of Byzantine architecture persisted. But perhaps the most subtle influence of Byzantium was its model of imperial endurance. Unlike short-lived medieval kingdoms that rose and fell quickly, Byzantium demonstrated the possibility of long-term institutional survival through adaptation. It endured invasions, civil wars, religious crises, and territorial collapse. Yet it persisted for over 1,000 years. This longevity itself became a historical lesson. In later European political thought, especially during the early modern period, scholars began studying Byzantine administration not as failure, but as resilience. They examined how centralized authority was maintained over diverse populations, how legal systems were preserved across centuries, how diplomacy functioned between rival powers, and how identity could remain stable even as territory changed. Byzantium became a case study in endurance under pressure. But over time, its memory also faded into abstraction. In Western Europe, the term Byzantine gradually replaced Roman when referring to the Eastern Empire. This linguistic shift had profound consequences. It created the impression of a separate civilization rather than a continuation of Rome. And with that, the sense of continuity between ancient Rome and medieval Constantinople became less visible in popular historical consciousness. But modern scholarship has reversed much of this perception. Historians now recognize that the Eastern Roman Empire was not a successor state. It was Rome itself in continued form. A Roman Empire that evolved linguistically, culturally, and religiously, but never ceased its identity. The people of Constantinople always called themselves Romans. Their laws were Roman. Their political institutions were Roman. And their imperial ideology was Roman. Even as Greek became dominant, even as Christianity reshaped governance, the underlying identity remained continuous. This continuity is one of the most important historical realities often overlooked, because it means that the Roman Empire did not fall in antiquity. It transformed in the medieval world and survived until the late Middle Ages. But even beyond academic interpretation, Byzantium's legacy continues to shape modern imagination. In literature, it appears as a symbol of complexity and endurance. In architecture, it is visible in domed structures across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. In religious traditions, it survives in Orthodox liturgy and practice. And in historical memory, it stands as one of the longest-lasting political systems in human history. A civilization that adapted so many times that its identity became layered rather than static. From Roman imperial foundations, to Christian Byzantine governance, to Ottoman imperial succession, to modern cultural memory, its influence never fully disappeared. It only changed form. And that is the defining characteristic of Byzantium. Not just survival, But transformation under pressure, a civilization that did not end suddenly, but evolved continuously until its political structure could no longer contain its accumulated change. And even then, its legacy continued far beyond its borders. Because empires are not measured only by their territory at the moment of collapse. They are measured by what survives after them. And Byzantium, more than most civilizations in history, survived in fragments scattered across law, religion, architecture, and memory. It is not a lost empire. It is an inherited one, carried forward by every civilization it once touched. By the time Constantinople fell in 1453, the Byzantine Empire had already been living in its own afterlife for decades. Not in a literal sense, but in the sense that its political body no longer matched its historical presence. What remained was a final core, a shrinking flame protected by walls that carried the memory of an entire civilization. And when that flame was extinguished, it did not vanish. It dispersed. Because Byzantium was never only a city. It was an accumulation of systems, identities, and ideas built over more than 1,000 years. And those systems did not end in a single morning of siege. They continued, embedded into the civilizations that followed. In the Ottoman world, Constantinople, now Istanbul, became the center of a new imperial order. But its foundation was not built on empty ground. It was built upon layers of Roman and Byzantine urban continuity. Roads still followed ancient routes. Water systems still relied on Roman engineering. Administrative geography still reflected older imperial divisions. Even the concept of a centralized imperial capital ruling a vast multi-ethnic territory had been refined over centuries of Byzantine governance. The Ottomans did not simply replace Byzantium. They inherited its structural logic and expanded it into a new imperial form. Meanwhile, in Europe, the intellectual consequences of Byzantium's fall accelerated a transformation already underway. Greek scholars who fled the city carried with them manuscripts that had been preserved in Byzantine monasteries for centuries. These were not just religious texts. They were fragments of a much older world. Philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, political theory. Works of Aristotle and Plato returned to Western Europe in more direct and accurate forms than had been available for generations. And this shift mattered, because it changed how Europeans understood the ancient world. It reshaped humanism. It strengthened the intellectual foundations of the Renaissance. And it accelerated a broader cultural movement that would redefine art, science, and philosophy across Europe. In this way, Byzantium functioned as a bridge civilization, a conduit through which classical knowledge survived long enough to re-enter the Western intellectual bloodstream. Without Byzantium, the Renaissance would not have taken the same shape. But Byzantium's influence was not limited to scholarship. It also reshaped political imagination. In the Orthodox Christian world, the fall of Constantinople created a vacuum of spiritual authority. For centuries, the city had been the symbolic center of Eastern Christianity. With its fall, that center shifted. And in Russia, a new ideological structure emerged. Moscow began to frame itself as the successor to Constantinople. The concept of the Third Rome took root. Rome, Constantinople, Moscow. A sequence of sacred imperial inheritance. This idea influenced Russian political identity for centuries, shaping how authority and religion intertwined in Eastern Europe. It was not a direct continuation of Byzantium, but it was a reflection of its enduring symbolic power. Even in Islamic civilization, Byzantine influence persisted in subtle but significant ways. The Ottoman administrative system incorporated many pre-existing bureaucratic structures that had developed in Byzantine governance. Tax systems, land organization, and court ceremonial practices all reflected layers of continuity beneath new ideological frameworks. In architecture, the influence became visible in monumental design. Hagia Sophia, converted into a mosque, became one of the most influential architectural models in the Islamic world. Its massive dome, engineered in the 6th century, continued to inspire Ottoman architects like Mimar Sinan. Mosques across the empire echoed its proportions and spatial logic. A Byzantine structure reinterpreted within a new cultural and religious framework. Even beyond institutions, Byzantium left behind a deeper legacy. A model of survival through adaptation. For over 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire endured repeated crises that would have destroyed most civilizations. Invasions from Persia, Arab expansion, Bulgarian and Slavic pressures, Crusader conquest, internal civil wars, economic fragmentation. And yet it survived, not by remaining unchanged, but by constantly restructuring itself. From Roman imperial governance, to Christian imperial ideology, to medieval defensive statehood, to cultural transmission under pressure, Byzantium was never static. It was continuously adapting. And that adaptability is its most important historical lesson, because it reveals something essential about long-lived civilizations. They do not survive by strength alone. They survive by transformation, by changing structure without losing identity, by absorbing pressure instead of collapsing under it, by redefining themselves when old forms no longer work. And eventually, even transformation has limits. By the 15th century, the empire had exhausted the possibilities of adaptation. Its territory had shrunk. Its resources had declined. Its political influence had faded. But its identity, its cultural memory, its intellectual legacy remained intact. So when Constantinople finally fell, it was not the disappearance of Rome. It was the end of its final political form. Rome had already existed for over a millennium in the East. And in that time, it had become something more complex than its ancient origins. A hybrid civilization, Greek in language, Christian in faith, Roman in law and identity, Byzantine in structure. And when that structure finally collapsed, what remained was not absence. It was diffusion. Across Europe, across the Islamic world, across Eastern Orthodoxy, across political philosophy, across architecture, across intellectual history. Byzantium did not end. It scattered, and those fragments became part of the modern world. So when we look at the ruins of Constantinople, we are not looking at a dead civilization. We are looking at a civilization that changed form, one that passed its legacy forward through every system it touched. And that is why Byzantium matters. Not because it was forgotten, but because it was never truly lost. It became part of everything that followed. And in that sense, its story does not end in 1453. It continues everywhere its influence still exists. Every church dome, every legal tradition rooted in Roman law, every manuscript preserved from antiquity, every political system shaped by imperial continuity, every historical memory of Rome that never fully disappeared. All of it carries echoes of Byzantium. And so the empire lives on, not as a state, but as an inheritance, a thousand-year civilization that refused to vanish quietly into history, and instead became part of the world that replaced it. Like and subscribe and comment what topic you would like to see covered in the next video.